So, what to do with that? I'm sure for all the real estate agents in the room, this was like a gripping first reading of that real estate transaction from Jeremiah. We love that. But maybe we should just go right at the parable, right? You know it, right? One is dressed in purple, feasting sumptuously every day. The other at his gate, covered in sores, longing for the crumbs from that table so richly laden inside. And his only comfort, if you want to call it that, is the dogs that lick his sores. Death, the great equalizer, happens, and Lazarus is carried away to Abraham's embrace, while the rich man finds himself in torment, gazing across this gaping chasm that he understands that he cannot cross. Janet's laughing right now. So I think, right? I think it's tempting to turn this parable into a tidy little tale of morality. I think it's tempting to do that. Rich in this case somehow fits the simplistic notion that rich is bad and poor equals good. Or it might be a way that those of us who are moved to do so might see Lazarus as sort of like a prop for charity, as one who just stands in there to teach us simply to share and be nicer. However, if we did that, a favorite, I think, of some of ours in this church, that Jewish mystic, Amy Jill Levine, some of us know her, she would be wagging her finger at us and say, "Not so fast." And I tend to listen to Amy Jill when she's either talking or I'm reading what she says. And that's because in her book, Short Stories by Jesus, she tells us that parables are meant to provoke us. They're not meant to be domesticated. They are not fables with neat and tidy morals. They are, in fact, disruptions. Stories that are meant to pull us, I think, many different ways, but ultimately into this posture of self-reflection. And that's because in the world of Jesus, the rich man is not some imaginary figure. He's not a cartoon character. He's not Scrooge McDuck, right? He's a very real person. He's recognizable in the street. He's even admired. And I think that's because in the ancient Israelite culture, being rich was thought by many to signal blessing, to signal God's favor, right? Wearing purple is a symbol of status. Having a full laden table where people can feast at, those are signs that your household is thriving and that you are indeed blessed. And meanwhile, Lazarus is but a nuisance at the gate. But Jesus does something unexpected here, like he does. He flips it on its head, right? He flips that expectation around because he says that the man who looks blessed is revealed to be cut off, even thirsting for a drop of water. And the man who looked to be cursed is carried off to Abraham's embrace. And I want us to hear this with some Old Testament ears, right? The rich man who is perceived to have God's blessing, nothing. The poor man, Lazarus, is carried into what is considered covenant blessing, this place of covenant intimacy, into the very arms of Abraham himself. That's huge. And I can imagine that there were Pharisees present when Jesus was telling the stories. Perhaps they groaned, right? Perhaps they pushed back a little bit, right? Because being wealthy doesn't necessarily mean that you're wicked, right? Perhaps they would have said, the rich man never walked out and kicked Lazarus off his property. He didn't order him to be forcefully removed from the gates. But sin in this case is subtler than that. The man didn't see Lazarus. Perhaps day after day the rich man walked by Lazarus and didn't pay him any mind. He just kept going. The parable almost describes him as being insulated from the world around him. One where one gets up and just dressed in purple and feasts sumptuously every day. Maybe he is unable, or perhaps he is unwilling to cross that threshold of his house. Perhaps he has people that do that for him, and he never makes it there. Where is the threshold for compassion? Which makes me want to tread a little bit lightly here. We've talked about wealth. But what about the other thing the parable talks about? The great equalizer, death. Most of what I've read in preparation for this suggests that this parable is not some sort of travelogue of the afterlife. I think it's meant to be closer to us than that, because we're very much alive hearing this, as were the people who heard Jesus tell this parable. I think before us is a story that illustrates the unveiling of God's justice and a pretty serious indictment of indifference. I think it's about the chasms we create between wealth and poverty, between health and sickness, and between neighbor and stranger. And those chasms, we know, are not just economic. They're not just political, but they're relational. They're highly relational. Did you notice that the rich man only calls Lazarus by name after he dies? And that's when he wants something from him. He never once addressed him in life. Lazarus was always just the man at the gate. And so as hard as it is, I hope that we can pause for a moment and resist the urge to ask the question that I think this parable prompts in this moment. Where are we going to end up? Rather, I'd like us to ask a different question. Who are we not seeing? Who is lying at our gates? Who is in our neighborhood? Who is in need of recognition in our pews, in our schools? Who is longing to be seen? How do we recognize dignity in them? And how do we create connections between us and them? This gives me a good way to segue into the real estate deal, Keely, so that's what I'm going to do. Jeremiah's in prison, folks. Not a deep, dark dungeon, but he's under house arrest. Babylon is laying siege to Jerusalem. The city is collapsing. Land values are pretty much worthless, right? Property, in some sense, is meaningless. The future looks sealed. Babylon is going to raze Jerusalem to the ground. And here goes Jeremiah, buying some land, which in the face of all that seems, I think, very, very irrational. Like, save your money, dude. You're going to need it. And he goes ahead and buys it anyway. He calls for witnesses. He weighs out the silver. He signs the deed, and he seals it in a jar. Jeremiah is investing in the future that no one can see. Jeremiah is hoping. He's prophesying, in a sense. Because when the world says it's over, Jeremiah says God is not finished. The field may be rubble today, but one day vineyards will be planted, children will run and play, life will return to Jerusalem. And Jeremiah's purchase of that land is a visible sign of an invisible grace, that God's promises will outlast empires, and that God's mercy will endure even when everything around us seems to be collapsing. You know, to buy a field in the face of destruction is to trust that God's future is real, not just something that we hear about. To name a man, to say Lazarus, to see Lazarus, to see one who is always ignored, in a sense, is to witness and to trust that by participating in God's kingdom, we will somehow reorder our values. Jeremiah's deed and Jesus' parable both insist that what seems small, what seems insignificant, what may be desireless, through the practice of naming, seeing, planting, and supporting, we are in fact witnessing and trusting in God's reign. In the Episcopal imagination, in which you all are a part of, right? This is what our sacraments are about. Outward and visible signs of inward and spiritual graces. That's the textbook definition that everybody knows. But it's bread and wine. It's water and oil. It's forgiveness. It's forgiveness. That are all reminders that God's grace is already at work in our lives. It's at work in bridging the chasms between Lazarus' despair and Jeremiah's hope, between neglect that we see all around us and restoration. I think this is why the Eucharist, why we gather each week for Eucharist, is central to our worship. Week by week, we kneel together at the same table, rich and poor, sinner and saint. We share in one feast. We share one bread and one cup. At that table, Lazarus is no longer invisible. And Jeremiah's field is no longer wasted ground. At that feast, we are shown a glimpse of God's future and invited to live as it were real, right here and right now, in Bartlesville. So, my friends, if you're here this morning hungry for meaning, thirsty for connection, and wondering if anybody really sees you, you are worthy. You're loved. You are not forgotten at the gate. You are called by name as one who is close to God's own heart. And if you are here surrounded by abundance, like most of us are in this room, this parable is not here to shame you. It's here to set you free. Free to see with new eyes. Free to cross thresholds that others don't. Free to see neighbors as companions rather than strangers or even enemies. Jeremiah, in an act of hope, took that deed, buried it in a jar for a really, really long time as a witness to God's future. I think we are invited to do the same, even faced with all the uncertainties that we face. Not by buying fields, but by investing in relationships, in compassion, and in justice. Each time we recognize Lazarus in our own lives, each time we cross the bridge of indifference, each time we live as though God's promises are real, we are in fact staking our silver on hope.